well, as they say, better late than never. Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel and welcome to this special video. As you can see, I have all my PlayStation 30th anniversary stuff I have. Wish I could have gotten the Edge if the fucking website worked, but well, I got the Portal at least, which is the thing I wanted more than the Edge, so I guess we can't be too picky what we got. But we got the console, we got the DualSense, and we got the Portal here. And well, because we are doing a video about the 30th anniversary of PlayStation that I should have done 2 weeks ago, but I didn't because I got lazy and distracted by other things. So yeah, sorry. Also took a month. The plan is for the PS5 Pro follow-up video. If I decide to do it, it's gonna be on the tech channel. But there's one video I want to do on the tech channel before I do that. So yeah. But today we're gonna be going over the history of PlayStation, going over all the PlayStation stuff from basically from start to now. And yeah, I thought it'd be a very fitting thing for the 30th anniversary, which doesn't end till the 20th. So I'm not that late. So Sony's first foray into gaming, so to say, actually happened with Nintendo, which we'll get into that later, more into that later. But the first thing that Sony really did in the gaming industry, or at least for this story, and with Ken Kutaragi, who's the father of the PlayStation, is they made sound chips for the Super Nintendo. And you may be thinking, they did? Well, here's a SNES motherboard. Don't worry, this one doesn't work. That's why it's out. Here's a SNES motherboard. As you can see, Sony, and less obvious, it says Sony on this chip as well. And these are the sound chips for the Super Nintendo. This was actually done in secret by Ken Kutaragi. Sony execs did not want to do it. Oh shit. Ken Kutaragi did this in secret, as to, you know, since Sony didn't want to do it. So yeah, that's a very good thing to know. This actually used to be on a daughter board, but this is a later revision of the board that started directly to the main board. But yeah, that was, you know, Sony's first foray into the gaming industry. They did some parts for the Super Nintendo. They also made some games for the SNES under the Sony ImageSoft division of the company as well. Now, this is where history starts to become more known, and this is where PlayStation starts to come into it. So initially, Sony and Nintendo actually were working together to make the PlayStation, where, well, not quite. The Sony agreed with Nintendo that they were going to make a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom. Sony would make the add-on, but they also would get to make their own version of the SNES called the PlayStation, which would be the SNES built in with the CD add-on. So it would be their own SNES that they manufacture. This is the prototype you see. It's real. It's not something that's fake. There was apparently about 100 of these made, but only a few. That may be the only one that's left. I think almost all of them were destroyed, and that may have been the one that's left. But yeah, that is actually where the PlayStation got started. It got started as a add-on for the Super Nintendo. I feel like this is kind of well known, and what I'm about to say next is well known. But yeah, I feel like that's a kind of important thing. You can kind of see the font for PlayStation actually comes here. It is two separate words. Speaking of which, these variants were like, they're like kind of like these weird versions of game consoles. I'm gonna make a video about that as well, as sort of a follow-up to the redesigns. But yeah, so that's what I will be doing a video on. But yeah, Sony did make a Super Nintendo. But here's the thing, and I'll present the version of events that is normally portrayed by most YouTubers, is that Nintendo betrayed Sony for some reason, because of licensing or whatever, and actually made a deal with Philips instead of Sony, behind Sony's back, to make a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. They did this one day after Sony announced, or maybe it was one day before. It was either one day before or one day after Sony announced their own Super Nintendo add-on and their own PlayStation. And it's really notable. It's really important to notice that Philips is not a Japanese company. Philips is a Dutch company. And in Japan, especially back in the day, working with the foreign company over the domestic company is sort of seen as not seen as not good. So yeah, Nintendo really did betray Sony in that sense. So the thing is, it is kind of not Nintendo's fault what they did. Hear me out. So Nintendo was scared, and kind of rightfully so, that Sony was going to take over Nintendo in a way, because the thing is that Sony got to get all the licensing rights for the CD add-ons. It's all the CD add-on games. And they're getting to make their own Super Nintendos, meaning that it's a possibility that Sony could have just sort of taken over the SNES and the CD add-on, leaving Nintendo high and dry. So that it's not really that hard to think about. I mean, Sony's a ginormous company. Nintendo is not that big of a company even now. It's a relatively small company. So Sony is a giant company, especially back in the 90s. So actually, even though Nintendo's sort of portrayed as the bad guys, and while they did kind of do something bad, they were doing it out of defense. They weren't really doing it out of just to be rude. They did it out of fear that Sony would take over. But nonetheless, Sony did not like this at all. Ken Kutaragi felt betrayed. And, well, their response, they'll do it on their own. No Nintendo needed. And on December 3rd, 1994, this thing came out. The Sony PlayStation. One word, not two. And, well, I don't know if they would be better off with Nintendo or not, but they did pretty good by themselves. So let's just first talk about the PlayStation and, go over the specs, and we'll compare the specs of all the PlayStation consoles as we go on. And, well, so it was released on December 3rd, 1994, and in Japan, and then 1995 in the US and Europe. So the original PlayStation had a 32-bit RISC CPU clocked at 33.8 megahertz. It had 2 megabytes of RAM and 1 megabyte of video RAM. So 3 megabytes of RAM in total. And it had 16-bit 24-channel sound. And if you ever play PlayStation games, you'll know how good the sound is on the last week and stuff. I don't have the controllers with me because it's a little much right now. But the original PlayStation controller was basically not too different than now. It was basically just the D-pad and the 4 face buttons, and then the 2 sets of buttons on the top. So it's actually kind of weird to think about, but the original PlayStation controller is basically just a Super Nintendo controller with 2 extra buttons on the top and some hand rests. It's not actually that different. It is kind of crazy to think how, even though it seems like very different, the PlayStation controller original PlayStation controller really just is a Super Nintendo controller with 2 extra buttons and a better ergonomic feel. That didn't last too long though. Well, it didn't. Well, it did. But not too long after the release of the PlayStation and after the release of the Nintendo 64 with the analog stick that was used fantastically for Mario 64, Sony came out with the dual analog. You expect me to say DualShock, but hold on. Sony came out with the dual analog controller, which was basically a PlayStation 1 controller with 2 analog sticks on the bottom. So I guess they tried to one-up Nintendo with that second analog stick. And not too long after, they came out with the DualShock, which was basically the same thing, but it had 2 vibration motors. So yeah, a lot of people don't know about the dual analog. There's like one video talking about it, but there's a little bit more trivia for you. I don't know why I thought this, but the N64 is more powerful than the PlayStation 1. I don't know why I thought it was less powerful. I always thought that the PlayStation 1 was the technically superior console over the N64, but I think it's just because the storage was so low on the N64 that you could store more on the PlayStation, but yeah, if you think about it though, there's a lot less of that like weird triangle polygon stuff going on with the N64 than the PS1, but the games were smaller because of the cartridges. So yeah, it's actually less powerful than the N64, but because of the CD, it was allowed to do. There was a lot more stuff that could be done on the PlayStation 1, kind of. And I mean, the Sega CD also, sorry, the Sega Saturn also had a CD playback, of course. But as I've sort of done more research into Sega, Sega is always been more about bringing arcade consoles to the home. And the Sega Saturn, from what I know, was more powerful than the PS1, but from what I remember, it's a pain to develop for. And well, Sega Saturn is mostly arcade games on home, which is basically what all Sega consoles are, even the Genesis. It just kind of doesn't appear that way, but it was also very famously
$2.99,
$100 cheaper than the Sega Saturn, even though you had to buy a game and had to buy a memory card, which kind of brought the price similar. But yeah, $2.99, the price heard around the world, and I love that clip. I will fit that clip into any video I can. But yeah, the PS1 was very famously $2.99, and well, made it very competitive. I don't know if Sony was in the practice of losing money on consoles back in the day. Like now, I mean, I think the PS5 is making money, but it didn't forever. Most game consoles usually lose money for the first few years at least, until they, that's why they usually do redesigns, by the way. But yeah, well, the most important thing about a game console is not the price or the specs, it's the games. The PS1 to me is probably about my third favorite PlayStation console. Until the PS5, it was my second favorite. I mean, Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Twisted Metal, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Gran Turismo, Resident Evil, Rayman, Ridge Racer.
Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
Parappa the Rapper, Silent Hill, and the first Persona. All came out on the original PlayStation. Tons of great franchises. It was just a really good console. There's a reason that the PlayStation 1 is as popular as it was. Later on, they came out with the actual PlayStation 1, the PS1. There's a redesign. It was cheaper, much smaller, as you can see, which is kind of insane how much smaller it is, although it does have a external power supply, but whatever. Yeah, there was also an LCD screen they released for this, so it was kind of like a portable console in a way. You just plug into the wall, and had an LCD and whatever, so you can play your PlayStation 1 games on the go. These two units of the PlayStation combined did sell over 102 million units, which is still a crazy number. And well, it's a great legacy. But well, we all know Sony did not stop at one, because in the year of 2000 they released 2001 they released the PlayStation 2. Definitely was an upgrade over the PS1. The Emotion Engine CPU, a very famous CPU, was clocked at 294 megahertz, which is 8.6 times the clock speed of the PS1 CPU. It came with 32 megabytes of RAM for the Emotion Engine, 2 megabytes of RAM for the input-output processor, which, by the way, on the original models of the PS2, the input-output processor is the PS1 CPU, meaning that it had the launch models of the PS1. Oh, shit. The original fat models of the PS2, and I think some of the slim models, all have hardware emulation, not even emulation, hardware backwards compatibility with the PS1, which is just flippin' awesome to think about. And it makes, and I mean, they could have used a different processor, but I think it's pretty cool the way they did this. Like, well, we'll just use the PS1 processor and make that backwards compatible with the PS1 that way. A graphics synthesizer, the graphics card or graphics processor unit, also had 4 megabytes of RAM, which totaled the total RAM of the system to 40 megabytes, which is 4 times the PlayStation. Well, actually, well, no, it's not. It's 40 megabytes total, which is more than 10 times the original PlayStation. Yeah, I was trying to say it's 4 times more than the original VRAM on the PS1. But yeah, the graphics inside, believe it or not, is actually capable of doing HD. It can do 720p and 1080i in very specific games. I think GT3 maybe one game that supports it, but I'm not 100% sure. And it's also the first console I know of with USB ports. And this is a FireWire port, I believe. And this was used for the iLink connector to have like LAN PS2s. Another thing that the PS2 has, one of the two things that the PS2 has, is option for a hard drive and internet. So the original the Sega Dreamcast, which is the first of the 6th generation consoles, did actually have dial-up and later broadband. But yeah, the PS2 I think was probably the first common console to have broadband, and then the original Xbox as well. The GameCube actually had an adapter for it, but I think it was all LAN for the most part, so I've never really seen many games that support it. It had an option for a hard drive, which is the only other console that really had that was the Xbox that came out the same year. And yeah, which is, I mean, pretty crazy. You can actually run Linux on the PS2, which is something they would never let you do nowadays. But yeah, you could run Linux on the PlayStation 2 with the hard drive. And I guess it was a pretty decent machine. The PS2 is less powerful than both the GameCube and the original Xbox, so, you know, take that what you will. The DualShock 2 is not much of a looks difference between the DualShock 1, although it became the standard controller now, and I believe you can still use DualShock controllers. Mostly the PS2 is a lot of sequel games from PS1 games, but there's definitely a good amount of new games as well. So of the games I have listed, I have the GTA trilogy. The original GTA was on the PS1, but it's nothing like the GTA, so this is really where GTA got started, in my opinion. The GTA trilogy: God of War, Okami, Sly Cooper, Ratchet and Clank, Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, Time Splitters, Jak and Daxter, and as well sequels to Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, and Final Fantasy. Later on, I believe around 2005, the PS2 Slim came out. Look at the size. I'll take the memory card. Look at the size difference. Oh my god. Now, again, this one does have an external drive, although the 9000 series was able to get an internal drive in this thing. I mean, look at this thing. It was the same form factor. They got the motherboard to be this small, and then but have this, like, oh my god. This one is external, but good lord, this thing's crazy. They took out the PS1 processor, so the emulation for the PS1 is software-based, although it's pretty good emulation. And a big thing they did was some revisions of this, not all revisions for some reason, but some revisions of this, have the graphics synthesizer and the emotion engine on one chip, which is kind of important for the future. The PS2 sold over 116 million units, which is still the most sold units of a game console of all time. Now, the reason this number is so high, and this is something very clever on Sony, it is basically the cheapest DVD player you could buy in 2001. Because, as I said, the idea of game consoles is usually to lose money in the beginning and then make it back with game sales, or just eventually make it cheaper. Well, the console was basically the same price as a DVD player. So if you're, shopping for a DVD player in 2001, you're either getting a DVD player that costs $300 and does only play DVDs, or you're getting a DVD player, or you're getting a game console that plays games and can play DVDs right out of the box for $300. Well, even if you don't plan on playing games, it's a pretty obvious choice. And of course, Sony is a name brand, a very big name brand at the time, especially. So you're probably gonna go with the PlayStation. Or if you're a kid, well, you can convince your parents to buy you a PS2 because it plays DVDs. So it's a practical purchase as well as a fun one. So yeah, had the PS2 not been a DVD player, I assure you it probably not would have sold as well, but great games on it, so nothing to fault it there for. The original Xbox actually could play DVDs as well, but you needed an add-on, which the PS2 did not need an add-on, so yeah. There were some other accessories for the PS2 as well, the iToy camera and the microphones and the game show buzzers, but yeah, they're only for like a very specific few games. All right, we're going to move on to the next Sony console, which I don't have, so we'll leave the PS2 here, which is oh, I forgot to mention Kingdom Hearts was also on the PS2. Alright. The PSP is Sony's first ever portable console. It was basically designed to compete with Nintendo, who dominated the handheld market, and arguably still does. But I would say that it is the first portable console that was basically a home console on the go. Because, well, for the time, and it is kind of crazy, the PSP was crazy powerful. And at a variable clock speed of 1 to 33 megahertz, it's a variable clock speed, so it could lower to save battery. It had 32 megabytes of RAM at launch, and the 2000, 3000 models actually had 64 megabytes of RAM. It had USB 2.0, which is kind of crazy for 2005 handheld. A memory stick, which we'll talk about, and it had a resolution of 480 by 272, so not super high def. It's kind of argued about whether the PS2 or the PSP is more powerful. The PSP is, I think, on paper less powerful, but it had a smaller screen, so the graphics are roughly kind of the same. It's a mess, but basically it's a PS2 on the go. A big thing is, and basically, it being a PS2 on the go means a lot of PlayStation 2 games were on there. GTA, Vice City Stories, and Liberty City Stories, which are like prequels to the PS2 games respectively. And they basically have the same map. The full maps of those games are on the PSP version. God of War games, Gran Turismo, Monster Hunter, Ratchet & Clank, Final Fantasy, and Daxter all were on the PSP, or like basically kind of like portable versions of the home console games. And a lot of the reason this is possible was because of the UMD, which was like a mini disc, like a mini DVD that could store up to 1.8 gigabytes, which is actually more than the GameCube discs could store. I think those are like 1.1 or 1.2 gigabytes. So yeah, the PSP UMDs also had movies, so you can watch movies on the go in a pretty decent format in the way of, although a portable DVD player would probably be a better option at the time. And digital distribution was available as well. It's the first console I know of to have digital distribution, at least mainstream, because maybe the Xbox 360, but it's around the same amount of time. It's definitely the first portable console digital distribution, because the DS did not have digital distribution at launch. The DSi did in 2010. And there's a first console I know to be digital only, with the PSP Go, which was like a portable, even more portable version of the PSP, which would like slide open and whatnot, that only had downloaded games from the PlayStation Store. And the PSP did do pretty well. It sold about 80 million units, which is, pretty good for a handheld at the time, although I don't think nowadays that's a super big number. All right, we're going to move back to the home consoles with all right, so the PlayStation 3 came out in 2006, and even before it came out, it had a rough time. Why?
We will make PlayStation 3 available via a two configuration plan. One with a 60 gigabyte hard drive disk and the other with a 20 gigabyte hard drive. In North America, the PlayStation 3 will be available at retail on November 17th, 2006. The 20 gigabyte PlayStation 3 will retail for $499 US and 549 Canadian dollars. And the 60 gigabyte PlayStation 3 for $599 US, $659 Canadian.
Look familiar?
Yep. It was $600 in 2006, which, adjusted for inflation, is this number as of December 2024. This thing was fucking expensive. So with, I try not to swear on my videos, but I wanted to emphasize this one. This thing was expensive, and well, we'll kind of go over why. It had a PowerPC based cell processor clocked at 3.2 gigahertz, which is 11 times the PS2 clock speed and 95 times the PS1 clock speed, which was released about 12 years before. So we got 95 times more power, or I don't want to say more powerful, but 95 times faster than in a span of about 12 years. It had 6 cores, kind of, they're like processing units, but it had 6 cores with 1 additional core for the OS and another core for production yield. So basically 1 would be disabled. So if that case, 1 core didn't work for some reason, they had that backup core. It had 256 megabytes of shared RAM between the CPU and the GPU, which is 6.4 times the PS2 and 84 times the amount of RAM in the PS1. Had the reality synthesizer, which is basically the sequel to the graphics synthesizer, which was the GPU for the PS2, and the original model of the PlayStation 3, the fat one, came with that same Emotion Engine graphics synthesizer chip. So the PS2 emulation was once again not emulation, it was just PS2 hardware on the PS3 motherboard. Although all PS1 games would do software emulation, which the PS2 was already doing at this point anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, so this is also a reminder, they removed PS3 and PS2 emulation later on because the software emulation didn't work. Every PS3 can still play PS1 games though, so if you did not know that, even if you have a Slim or a Super Slim, that will still play PS1 games. Anyway, it came with the 6-axis controller, which you maybe noticed, it's not DualShock 3. Well, the 6-axis controller was basically a DualShock 3 with DualShock 2 with analog triggers, a battery, and wireless capabilities, but without the vibration motors. And this is because they were in a lawsuit with the company that had the patent for the vibration technology. So there's actually, believe it or not, DualShock 2s around this time that do not have the shock function as well because of this same lawsuit. So it's not just the 6-axis, it was some models of the DualShock 2. Eventually Sony figured this all out and they came out with the DualShock 3, which is basically the 6-axis with the rumble. So if we take the DualShock 2 versus the DualShock 3, the DualShock 3 has analog triggers and is wireless and has rechargeable battery. So yeah. Oh, and it has the motion controls, of course. It has a gyroscope, so it can tilt and move around and all that fancy stuff that we are now kind of used to, unless your name is Microsoft. The PS3 had a rough start for a long time, especially those first 3 years. It had poor sales compared to the Xbox 360, its direct competitor, just because the damn thing was too expensive. Like, there's no getting around that. $600 in 2006 was a lot to swallow. I know technically it was like kind of $500, but it's still a lot to swallow. I believe the original Xbox 360 was like $400, and I think some models were $300. Now, they didn't come with a hard drive, to be fair, but you know, at least it was, you can add it on later. With the PS3, you had to buy it with the hard drive. And well, a lot of times also the Blu-ray drive made it more expensive, which, you know, Sony is the inventor of Blu-ray, if you did not know. And like the PS2, they tried to bundle the PS3 with a Blu-ray player to make it more of a all-in-one device. The Xbox One could just play, the Xbox 360 could just play DVDs. There was an HD DVD add-on, which to me was like stupid. I mean, it didn't last very long. But yeah, the cell processor, the reality synthesizer, and that Blu-ray drive made this expensive. And on top of that, because the PS3 had less RAM and the cell processor was so hard to develop for, even though the PS3 was more powerful on paper, Xbox 360 games often ran better due to that increased RAM and that, you know, architecture that was just easier to develop for than the PS3. So yeah, that's also kind of something. You're paying a lot more for a console that often will perform worse. But eventually, they came out with this model, the PS3 Slim, and dropped the price to $300. And they came out with a series of ads with a man named Kevin Butler, And well, those ads are kind of famous, and I wish they would kind of bring it back nowadays, but I don't think they need to advertise much.
She smells like strawberries.
The PS3 had a lot of good games from both old series and new series. So it had Uncharted, GTA 4, God of War 3, a few Gran Turismo games. Gran Turismo was a really weird era on the PS3. Metal Gear Solid 4, still the only way to play that game, by the way. Little Big Planet 1 and 2, Demon Souls, Red Dead Redemption, Last of Us, Infamous, and the start of the MLB The Show series was on the PS3. PS Move was a thing, which was basically like a Wii competitor where it uses these like light wands and a camera to track around stuff. Didn't really catch on as well. They had a PS3 3D TV, which was kind of crazy, not gonna lie. And later on, when the more towards the PS4 came out, they had the Super Slim, which was a basically even cheaper version of this system. But in the end, the PS3 sold 87 million units, which is like, I think 2 or 1 million more than the Xbox 360. But in my opinion, the Xbox 360 is the winner because of two reasons. One, this did not really get to that number until the very end, and I think a lot of that was due to Last of Us, which I did not write down on this list for some reason. Last of Us came out right at the end of the PS3, and I think people were buying PS3s just to play that game as well. Number two, I think the Blu-ray player aspect of it also kind of helped as well, which, you know, is a fair point, but that wasn't just because of the games. Like, the Xbox 360 had the games and Xbox Live going for it. It had nothing else going for it, to tell you the truth. Maybe Kinect, I don't know. And, well, Microsoft can't sell consoles in Japan for some reason. They never have been able to, and now I think they won't even exist there anymore, to tell you the truth. I think they're about to throw in the towel on that one. But yeah, if Japan did not exist, I guarantee you the PS3 would not have sold more than the Xbox 360. And at that tiny margin, I don't really think is fair to call the PS3 the winner because they just sold more consoles, because they didn't really sell that many more consoles, and a lot of that was just at the very end. So I'm gonna say this one lost the console generation, and in my opinion, and well, not in my opinion, basically it's the only PlayStation console to ever lose a generation. You know, I know technically it didn't lose, but it did. And yeah, and we'll move on to the next system. Not the PS3, but sorry, well, not the PS4, but I don't have a Vita anymore. So yeah, the PS Vita was released in 2012, 1 year before the next system. It had a quad-core CPU, which is kind of crazy for a handheld at the time, 512 megabytes of RAM, and 128 megabytes of VRAM, so it had like 3 times the amount of RAM of the PS3, which is kind of crazy. It had an OLED screen on the first model, and it was a touchscreen and a rear touchpad. It also had dual analog sticks, which I believe is the first handheld with dual analog sticks. It never really sold well outside of Japan, and especially compared to the 3DS, which sold many units. It was very powerful for the time. It was less powerful on the PS3 by quite a bit, although because of that smaller screen, you were able to get some pretty close to looking PS3 graphics out of it. And yeah, it's kind of an underrated console. It had remote play for both the PS3 and the PS4. So I forgot the PSP also had PS3 remote play, so bet on me on that one. The PS TV was a thing, which is basically like a Vita that connected only to your TV and only played like 30% of Vita games. It's some ridiculous number. But the Vita did sell, did have some pretty good games. Gravity Rush, Little Big Planet, Tearaway, which I think is the best PS Vita game, as well as one of the best PS4 launch games. Uncharted, Golden Abyss, and Persona 4. They redesigned it with the 2000 model with the LCD screen, so the OLED screen. So if you're ever trying to buy a Vita, I always suggest you get the 1000 model, even though you have to get a memory card, just because it's a much nicer screen. And I believe the unofficial number, because Sony does not want to say this number because I think they are embarrassed, the Vita sold about 13 million units, which is definitely their most underperforming system by far. We're going to move on to the next home console, which is I don't have a PS4 anymore, so we're going to make our own PS4. We're going to have a PS3 and a PS1. You add them together, boom, it's a PS4. That's how algebra works, ladies and gentlemen. So the PS4 was released in 2014 for $400, $100 cheaper than the Xbox One. And, well, this was a very important thing that they did, and it is probably the reason that the PS5 is outselling the Xbox One, or the Xbox Series X to this day. And I'll explain that later. But the Xbox One launched at $500 and included a Kinect. On top of that, they changed it before launch, but they had planned on making physical games restricted to your system, and you couldn't trade them in or anything like that. And, well, this pissed off people, and rightfully so, to a point where they just went and bought, people that had 360s were basically just buying PS4s. It was $100 cheaper, and, well, didn't always have to be online and didn't have a bunch of DRM.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
Microsoft basically removed all these features before launch, but the damage was done. Even though the Xbox One actually isn't really less powerful than the PS4, believe it or not. I think the PS4 is ever so slightly more powerful, but like not really. They both actually have the same processor and whatnot. So we'll go with this. The PS4, and by the way, I can't really get great specs for this just because of the way that it's still kind of classified. The PS4 had an 8-core APU, which is basically a CPU and a GPU mixed into one. It had 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is 32 times the PS3, 200 times the PS2, and 2,667 times the PS1. And it was x86 based, meaning it was based on PC architecture, making it a lot easier to program for. So very important restriction. No DRM, as I said. Well, I mean, it has some amount of DRM, but not like the Xbox One was going to have. And the DualShock 4, honestly, it's basically a DualShock 3 with better analog triggers, a touchpad, and a speaker and a light bar. Wasn't like a big improvement. I'd say probably the touchpad was the biggest improvement, although not too many games use it. I think Tearaway is the only one I know that uses it a lot. Most of it just uses it as an extra button. But, well, what the PS4, I don't know, it didn't really lack. But the PS4 did not have an innovative controllers it had in games. Games like God of War, Spider-Man, Horizon Zero Dawn, Uncharted 4, Last of Us Part 2, Ratchet & Clank Reboot, Bloodborne, Detroit Become Human, Final Fantasy 15, Persona 5, Kingdom Hearts 3, Metal Gear Solid 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, Terraria Unfolded, and of course, GTA 5. I know it was on 360 and PS3, but most people play it on PS4. Yeah. Also, a very big thing that came out on the PS4 was the PlayStation VR, which in my opinion is the first ever way that most people probably got into VR, because in 2016 when the PSVR came out, your options for VR were the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, and the PSVR 2. And, well, in order to use either of the other two, you had to have a gaming PC and then buy a $600 headset, whereas you could get a PS4 and a PSVR for $600. And you could just play PS4 games as well versus a gaming computer. And you have a gaming computer, but it's kind of hard to justify because you're spending probably like $1,000 for a gaming PC and then another $600 on the VR. So it's like $1,600 versus $600. So yeah, most people are probably going to go with the PSVR. And that's what I did back in the day. I did not have PC VR until 2016, or sorry, about 2018, 2019, when they finally lowered the price of the HTC Vive to like $300, I think. So that's actually how I got into PC VR. But for a while, all I had was the PSVR 1. And honestly, even though the resolution wasn't quite as good, and obviously the graphics aren't as good as what PC was, it was a pretty good system. Truthfully, I mean, it had a pretty decent screen, OLED screen. And I mean, it had most of the major VR titles. It had Beat Saber, it had Job Simulator. I mean, it had pretty much most of the PC VR games. So, you know, it was really not a bad way to get into VR. Also in 2016, they released the first ever mid-cycle upgrade with the PlayStation 4 Pro, which was the first also 4K gaming console. It had more power than the PS4. I don't know how much. I thought it had more RAM, but it doesn't. I think the Xbox One X did, and that's why I got confused. But it's basically higher clocked, and I think it had a better GPU on the APU. I can't tell you how much more powerful it is because I don't know, and Sony won't say either. In total, of all the units of the PS4, there are 117 million units sold. And that brings us now... Hold on. There's a secret PlayStation console. Well, actually, there's two, but not really. And it's tiny. Yes, my friends, the PS Classic. I didn't write this in the original script because I forgot about it. Why did I forget about it? Well, because it's pretty forgettable, and I think Sony kind of wants you to forget about it. I'm not going to talk too much about what this is, but basically, it is a mini console that was released in 2019 by Sony with PlayStation 1 games. It came with two original PlayStation controllers. They look like this. Pretty good looking, pretty good feeling actually, to be honest. And well, the device itself is actually, you know what, pretty good. It looks really good. It looks pretty much like the original PlayStation 1. The software, not the games, but the software on it is pretty good. The save slots are pretty good. I like how you have to hit the open disc button to change discs like the original one. And well, the packaging I thought was even good. And you see here. But the problem is when you turn it over, it's the games. And well, not that these games are particularly bad. I would say most of these games on here are pretty good, although I would say there's some odd omissions. Crash Bandicoot and Spyro to me are the biggest omissions as well. But I mean, we got a lot of good classic Final Fantasy VII, GTA, Destruction Derby, although Destruction Derby 2 would have been better. Metal Gear Solid, Tekken 3, Twisted Metal, again, Twisted Metal 2 would have been good. Wild Arms, Rayman, I mean, all pretty good games here. The problem with this was not the games themselves, it was the ROMs of the games, because they were using European ROMs. And well, that sucks because European ROMs run at 50 hertz, not 60 hertz, meaning the games are noticeably slower. So, yeah. It also cost $100, which is $20 more than the NES Classic. And, well, those issues in mind, along with the emulation, which I think is okay, although it has this terrible filter on it that you can actually disable because you can plug in a keyboard. These are just USB ports. You can plug in a keyboard and disable it that way. So, with, you know, it's just, yeah, very forgettable. I've already done a whole video on mini consoles that you can watch. I talk way more about this thing. The only thing I will say though is if you mod it like I've done with mine, which doesn't take more than 30 minutes to an hour of work, you can add some more PlayStation 1 games or even non-PS1 games. I have just added some PlayStation 1 games as I like to keep my mini consoles modded with the games appropriate. My NES Classic only has NES games, and my SNES Classic only has Super Nintendo games. My PS1 Classic only has PS1 games, but you can mod it. It's not that hard to mod, and you can actually make it a pretty good device. So, yeah. Well, we'll cut back to the rest of the video. Oh, by the way, the other missing PlayStation console is that weird memory card thing that was released in Japan. It's not really a console. It's just it's like a VMU basically from a Dreamcast. Yeah. Bye. Now, before I get into my previous video about the PS5, let's just get into the specs. The PS5 was released in November of 2020. It had very high demand, but it was very underwhelming for those first 2 years. And in my opinion, it was kind of underwhelming in 2023 and going into 2024. So it had an 8-core CPU, much like the last gen, but it had 16 gigabytes of RAM, which is 2 times the PS4 and PS4 Pro, 64 times the PS3, 400 times the PS2, and 5,334 times the PS1. Holy shit. Anyway, it is also what the hell did I write first console for? I just wrote first console. Oh, I know what I meant to write. It's also the first console that came standard with a solid state drive, which is important because you can only install PS5 games on the solid state drive or on a NVMe SSD. So, the DualSense was, well, we have a DualSense right here. It's the first one we have. Was a giant improvement over the DualShock 4, in my opinion, or later on especially. This is probably the biggest one. So it had this like HD rumble kind of thing, like the Switch controllers had, where it had a much more haptic feedback and had triggers that are adjustable and vibrating and whatnot. So I think that's a really big upgrade as well. Came with a built-in microphone, which is honestly awesome. So you always have a option. And yeah, honestly, I think one of the things I was most excited about when the PS5 came out was the controller, which even if the games are on PS4, that controller does add a whole new element to the game. So in terms of games, we have Spider-Man Miles Morales and Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man 2 being exclusive. God of War Ragnarok, which was on PS4 but was DLC exclusive. Horizon Forbidden West, same thing, DLC exclusive. Gran Turismo 7, not exclusive, but I've played on PS4. It runs like horse shit. Astrobot, exclusive to PS5. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, exclusive to PS5. Elden Ring, exclusive to current gen. Stellar Blade and Hogwarts Legacy were the big ones in my opinion. So this is where we're going to talk about my original PlayStation 5 video. I said that I felt like this console was kind of a ripoff. And, well, I don't feel like that was a wrong take, but I feel like my take is kind of done, not a 180, but like maybe like a 120 take, because I do feel like, especially those first 2 years, and then most of 2023, and even going into 2024, that video was in July, so this is like 5 months ago now. The PlayStation 5 did kind of feel like a ripoff because, well, most of the big name games were coming out on last gen, and well, I felt kind of like, well, I'm getting ripped off. Now, as someone that kind of cares a lot about performance, I didn't feel quite, I don't know why I kind of went like that as much, but if you're someone that doesn't care that much about performance, you would kind of feel like, man, I could have just kept my PS4 for another 2 or 3 years and played most of the games I wanted to play. 2023 and 2020 and really 2024 is when we started to see games that were not coming out on last gen at all. Spider-Man 2 was probably the first big game not to come out on last gen. Yeah, that was that's the first one I remember being like very exclusive last gen. Jedi, I think it was Fallen Survivor, also did not come out on PS4 initially. It came out. Jedi Survivor came out on PS4 this year, so it took an extra year. So I'm gonna count that as basically exclusive to the current gen, just because that's a long time to wait. Astrobot to me is the game that changed my entire perception on the PlayStation 5 because it was so fun. It was only on PS5. I'm like, man, this thing is awesome. And well, it did. I've started playing my PS5 a lot. I've started playing Outlaws on it. I've started playing Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered because I never beat Horizon Zero Dawn. And yeah, I mean, truthfully, it has really... Astrobot really did turn my opinion around on the PS5 because we had a true exclusive that was insanely fun. It wasn't technically groundbreaking. It used the controller in a bunch of great ways, though. I'll be fair about that. But yeah, honestly, that game basically changed my opinion on the PS5. It seems like, wow, it's not hard to change your opinion. Yeah, but it sort of led the way for my opinion being changed. Now, I don't know what's going to be out next year. I haven't really seen much. I think we're kind of all eyes on Nintendo for that one. I do know Indiana Jones is coming on PS5, which I'm kind of low-key pissed about because I think I've played so much of Indiana Jones so far, and I think Sony really, or Microsoft really could have kept that one and had got people to buy Xboxes. But yeah, maybe the license was too much to do that. But yeah, I've basically done like I wouldn't say a 180, but kind of like a 125, so to say, on the PS5. I still feel like it's not the greatest, but you know, a lot of times games come out those last 3 or 4 years of the console, so we'll see. Although I think COVID and the structure like that, so we'll see. I think like this console is gonna have the most mixed, other than the PS3 is probably gonna have the most mixed legacy of any PlayStation console. But we're not done yet. Last year, 2 very important add-ons came out for the PS5. The PSVR 2, which is a sequel to the PSVR, much improved PSVR. It has internal or inside-out tracking. Another, again, OLED screen, 120 hertz, 200p resolution per eye, and well, it's a pretty darn good headset. I think in my original video dissed that thing, and there is a lot to diss about it, but I have to admit, right now it's $300, I think. Or about, no, it's $350. At $350, I think it's very good as a second VR headset. Not as a primary one, unless you only care about playing wired, then it's honestly kind of better than the Quest 3, kind of. It's definitely better than the Quest 3S wired, but I don't know about the original. I don't know about the regular Quest 3. But Horizon Call of the Mountain and Gran Turismo 7 VR mode, to me, for $350, because that includes Horizon Call of the Mountain, I think is kind of worth it as a separate headset, especially if you have a PC, because now the PSVR 2 supports PCs, which it did not at the time I wrote that video, and that's the only reason I bought one. I bought one used for $250, and in my opinion, it is kind of better than the Quest 3 on PC. Don't buy a Valve Index. You either buy Quest 3 or PSVR 2. I can't recommend a Valve Index. But yeah, that kind of changed around. And well, the PS Portal, in my opinion, also came around. I think in that original video, I called it stupid. And that one I'm very wrong for. Because even before the new update, which lets you play on the cloud, the PS Portal is so much better than remote play on your phone. Because remote play on your phone is kind of a pain in the ass, because you have to pair that controller with it all the time. You have a much smaller screen than the PS Portal screen, which the PS Portal screen is beautiful. I don't know if the DualShock functions work on regular remote play. It may. I'm not sure. But the form factor of the PS Portal is just a lot nicer than the form factor of using a backbone or using a controller attachment, which is also kind of a pain in the ass. And you have a very top-heavy thing, which is not very fun. And also, you're just killing your phone's battery. Where for $200, yeah, I think I was kind of stupid on that point. PS Portal, if you know what it is, and especially now with the cloud streaming, I feel like it is a pretty solid device. So, yeah, I was wrong about that. I already made a video a while ago, basically saying I was wrong about the PS5. But, yeah. But, yeah, that brings us up to today. Sony eventually redesigned the PS5 to this design I have here for the 30th, although it's usually white. And, well, now we have the PS5 Pro, which is a more powerful version than the PS5. I mean, it's basically like PS4 Pro, although much more controversial because it does not come with a disk drive, and it's $700. So, kind of going back to that 2006 moment. But this is my slightly ranty kind of ranty overview of the PlayStation 5. Well, the PlayStation 30th anniversary from PS1 to PS5. I know I'm late, sorry, but yeah, Sony, I think of all, compared to Microsoft at least, Sony really has done a really good job. I think with every single system, even though I think the PS3 is kind of, I don't think Sony has ever made a bad console. Microsoft has kind of made a bad console. Nintendo, I think the Wii U is probably their worst, but I mean, like, Nintendo has some like okay consoles, but they don't have any bad consoles. Whereas Sony, I think other than the PS3, which to me is kind of I think Sony has really had the most consistent track record of quality of their systems. As I said, the PS3 is kind of the only issue with it, and it's not even a really bad console. But yeah, you know, greatness awaits is a very applicable thing for them. I feel like it's a very appropriate title because, well, we do have tons of greatness over here. So, what do you guys think? So again, sorry I was late. Let me know what you guys think of the video. Let me know if we have any great PlayStation moments. I'd love to hear about it. Your history. What's your favorite PlayStation console? Let me know in the comments below. And I'll see you soon. I already wrote 2 other videos that are much shorter that I'll have this week and next week. So thank you guys so much for watching. Check out my tech channel. I'm doing a review on the Meta Ray-Bans. And check out my second channel because I did a unboxing video for these and the PS Portal as well. So check all that stuff out. I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.
You